Our blood is boiling. We are just so angry. We're in the conflict. We're feeling it from all sides. Our senses are overwhelmed. What's your advice? Today, I'm joined by Dr. Larry Schooler. Dr. Schooler, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do.
Well, Ryan, it's great to be with you. I think of myself as a father of two and a husband of one, first and foremost, but I'm an assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas at Austin. I have a practice where I work with government agencies, nonprofit and corporate organizations on conflict resolution, consensus building, stakeholder engagement, strategic planning, just sort of anything that helps to build consensus on something that they need to decide upon.
Our blood is boiling. We are just so angry. We're in the conflict. We're feeling it from all sides. Our senses are overwhelmed. What's your advice?
I love that we're both smiling when we talk about blood boiling, but I'll tell you what I think I've told my students at the beginning of most semesters, which is conflict is, period. It's sometimes, I think, viewed as a disease that needs to be prevented, just something that will ail us and cause us tremendous strife. And the truth is, of course, that conflict can be very detrimental to us if we allow it to fester over long periods of time. But conflict also drives innovation. Conflict also leads to growth and maturity and the deepening of relationships. If you think about some of the most significant relationships in your personal and work lives, you'll probably recall some conflict that you've had with the people in those relationships. And we get into those kinds of conflicts when we express some vulnerability. Be patient. You're in the toughest part. It's sort of like after surgery when you first come out of anesthesia. If you go through anesthesia and you feel completely disoriented and maybe in some pain because the medicine hasn't kicked in, and then you go through a recovery period. I think that sometimes in conflict, we feel hurt and we feel uncomfortable and don't really know what is to come. We don't know what to expect in the future. And my experience tells me that if we are willing to stay in it, if we're willing to kind of not leave the kitchen when things get hot, or at least after taking a break, return to it. I think there certainly are times when it's not healthy to engage without some sort of pause, even if it's for several days. But if we're willing to go back into that heated kitchen, so to speak, I think the rewards can be tremendous. And I also really want to make sure that people who have grown up in an atmosphere of debate, of persuasion, recognize that, yeah, sure, there are some benefits to winning an argument and prevailing. Those are pretty short-lived in my experience, especially in relationships you're hoping to maintain. And so, look, I'm the son of a litigator. I was very much brought up in a household where you needed to state your case and make your point and sort of win over a parent or a sibling or something. Nowadays, I'm much less interested in being right and much more interested in being heard. And I hope that people will acknowledge that even if you don't, so to speak, get your way, if you're being heard, then you're being appreciated, you're being respected, and hopefully more often than not, your basic needs and interests are going to get met.
We met through UTSA's Dialogue and Deliberation Initiative. And that initiative is all about, and that center is all about exactly what you're talking about. How do we know when to put the brakes on our litigator mind and embrace this idea of seeing the other side, perspective taking, empathy, all the things that we teach in conflict management?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I do think that one of the things that the way you ask that points to is that I think we live in a country, and frankly, I don't ascribe that. I don't ascribe what I'm about to say to just the last 10 or 15 years. I really do think that in some ways our country has always had a culture rooted in debate, in partisanship, in winner-take-all kinds of circumstances. It's probably a fool's errand to think we can completely alter that in sort of permanent ways. I think we can hope to, as you say, kind of create space where something different than that can occur. But I also think that I can certainly think of times where, because of something core to who I am as a person, I have felt the need to assert a position. Now, I may ultimately want to find common ground with whoever I'm asserting that to. But when it comes to my family, when it comes to my faith, there are just certain things where, yes, I'm certainly open to conversation, but there is probably a phase during which I need to make sure that my red lines are drawn, so to speak, that it's clear what I will and won't be able to accommodate or compromise on, so to speak. And I think that's another thing. And we sometimes kind of think of this binarily as either I'm going to push my side and win, or I'm going to compromise. And when we think about all the different uses of the word compromise, including someone being compromised, I can't think of a positive connotation there. And so people, I think, view compromise, unfortunately, as some sort of a defeat or a weakness or giving up something that is really important to you. And so I hope that people will understand that when we talk about this alternative paradigm, the goal isn't necessarily to focus on concessions. The goal is to focus on, I would say, curiosity, on the cultivation of a deeper understanding of something that you may not have understood at more than a superficial level, a focus on clear communication of your own perspective without denigration of the other person's perspective. We are, as my grandfather, may he rest in peace, used to say, we are quick to criticize and slow to compliment. It's very easy when you hear someone say something that you object to criticize them. And it's not that we should compliment someone who is being hateful towards us. It's more that I think we should consider it and allow it to maybe just sit there for a moment, consider where there could be some redeeming quality to it, redeeming value to it, and then respond, but not necessarily respond in a way that says you're wrong and I'm right. Simply, you've given me your position. I appreciate you sharing. Here's a different perspective that I'd like to share. So that's generally the way that I approach any kind of conflict in my own life is, I know that there will be times that I vehemently disagree with someone about something, but I think I can do that in almost every instance without denigrating them, but more just making clear how distinct my position or point of view might be.
Let's zoom in even further. You have done really important work with Orlando after the Pulse nightclub shooting. Can you speak about that work and how it might apply to everyday conflicts in the workplace or in the lives of our audience?
Orlando, of course, is a place that most people associate with fun, with fantasy, with vacation, with great weather half the year. Orlando, of course, though, was also the site of what at the time was the worst mass shooting in American modern history until the Las Vegas shooting, sadly, a year or so later. But 49 people were killed at the Pulse nightclub, which catered to the LGBTQ plus population. It happened to be Latin night. And so there was a real perception at first that what had taken place was not just a gruesome mass killing, but also a hate crime against multiple populations. It may or may not have been. It's not particularly well known because the shooter died, but the impact of the shooting was felt well beyond the club, well beyond the city of Orlando. People whose loved ones were killed received well wishes from around the world. Pulse, for a lot of people, came to represent a moment like Stonewall or some other major mile marker in the history of LGBTQ and other populations. What's interesting about my engagement here is that it came after about an 8-year period of efforts to build a memorial to that tragedy. There was a nonprofit foundation that was created by the former owners of the club that was attempting to do what I'm working on now. And I don't think it's too important to go into the details, but the bottom line is it did not succeed. The foundation eventually dissolved, and the city acquired the property where the Pulse stood and took over the process. But it is relevant to our conversation because there really, at a certain point in that group's work, became some very sharp dividing lines over what should be done with the memorial, how much it should cost, what it should look like, the extent to which it should generate revenue, the extent to which it should be for, kind of a tourist audience as compared to more of a private space and so on. And as I have gotten into this work, I have recognized that those conflicts are not resolved. And I don't even know that I can be the one to help resolve them because there's such a sense of urgency after 8.5 years to get the memorial built that if we spent a lot of time trying to heal some of those old wounds, we would get a lot of folks saying, you're wasting time, get the memorial built. As it relates to what you're talking about, I do think we have to appreciate how in every interaction, people who are parties to that interaction or parties to that conflict are bringing much more than whatever is immediately apparent to that exchange. There's a theoretical model in conflict resolution known as the lens model, and it's fairly intuitive, but it's this idea that You and I could be having this conversation, and I may see it as a chance to hang out with a colleague and chat, and you may see it as an opportunity to educate your students. That's fairly benign. But there could be another experience where I'm approaching someone on the street that I don't know particularly well, and they see me as an abject threat, and I see them as a potential new friend, for example. In my experience with Orlando, what I've come to realize is, at the risk of putting too fine a point on it, nothing is exactly as it seems in terms of people's experience, both of Pulse and of the process of building a memorial. For example, I remember in one of the first meetings, I may have used the phrase, the 49 whose lives were lost. And I was immediately taken to task because the person who heard that thought that it was an inappropriate way to characterize people whose lives were destroyed, who were killed, that to him lost felt accidental or something like that. So that's not me trying to make us all into word police. What it's me trying to do is, let's say you and I were in some sort of disagreement or conflict, and you had a reaction to something in our shared workplace that I thought was unusual, unexpected, and so on. Sometimes our reaction to those unexpected moments is to either withdraw or to, what's the big deal, kind of try to downplay it. And again, I think that's a moment to lean into curiosity, to ask, what else might be happening with related to some other experience. Maybe you've been in multiple meetings where people have cut you off. And so when I inadvertently did that, it wasn't just that I jumped in before you were finished. It was that you've constantly felt undermined in our shared workspace. Or maybe there was a moment where I didn't fully acknowledge the contribution you made to a project. And even though I had said something, you had spent so much time in the organization feeling like you were playing second fiddle. And so this was just another straw that broke the camel's back. So I think a lot of times, especially in workplace situations where we don't know the full person, we may only know the person as our colleague, we can't fully appreciate everything that they are seeing and hearing and feeling in the interactions we have with them. I'll give you a concrete example of this. During the height of the war in Israel and Gaza, someone posted something on our company-wide Slack, like Teams, our Slack channel, that said, "Happy Passover. I look forward to the end of the genocide," implying Israel was engaging in genocide. And without getting too deep into it, I'm Jewish. My wife and I met in Israel. We honeymooned in Israel. I was greatly upset by the comment. And so when I decided to have a one-on-one conversation with him, with the poster of that comment, who happened to be also Jewish, I learned a lot about him that explained some of why he felt the way he felt. And he learned about me as more than just any sort of monolith, just a Jewish person or just a blind supporter of Israel or whatever the stereotypes were. And so I'm not trying to pat myself on the back for that interaction, but I am trying to make sure listeners understand that that's not normal. I think the normal reaction would have been for me to reply in thread and then for others to pile on and there to be a bunch of likes and dislikes and haranguing, because that's easy, right? I mean, that's an easy set of clicks. It took a lot more effort to have that kind of conversation. And I felt pretty emotional during it. And I wasn't always thrilled with how the conversation progressed. But I feel really good talking about it now with you. I feel a sense of peace around it, even though obviously there is no peace lasting in the Middle East. So I just think we are only ever going to see a part of the picture in that initial communication with someone. We're not going to have the benefit of understanding all of the lived and worked experiences that go into the way they're processing that interaction. So no, we don't need to know their whole life history. We don't need to ask them for it. But if a reaction is much different than we're expecting, we at least have an opportunity there to lean in and ask, what else is coming up for you in this, or that's a different reaction than I expected. What else are you feeling about this, or something to that effect?
Yes. And I know that we've all heard advice like empathy and advice like centering and those sorts of things. But I think that what you could help us with is the dangers and the pitfalls in following some of this advice. For example, the danger of labeling someone else's experience, which is one of those strategies that people often say, you should try to label their experience in a way that shows that you understand and you have empathy for that person. But I have seen that backfire, and I'm sure you have too. Can you think of some pitfalls in the common wisdom of dealing with conflict?
That's interesting. I smiled at first when you said empathy, because I remember once my now 10-year-old did something in the house that was supportive of his older brother. And I said, that was really nice, that you were there for Sammy. And he goes, called empathy? Acted like I should just know that, obviously, in a very non-empathic way. But I gave him a pass. I think centering in and of itself often gets a bad rap because it gets associated with meditation or deep breathing or just a kind of an ecosystem that feels outside of a lot of people's experience. And speaking frankly, my wife is a regular meditator and doer of yoga and such, and I'm not. And so sometimes it's hard for me to get into that sort of a mindset of let me slow down, let me breathe, and or that's really going to help. Like I'm still going to be angry after is the message I'm hearing in my head. And yes, I think there can be pitfalls associated with a moment of empathy or a strategy of empathizing where, let's say I'm listening to you and you're venting. The advice to just name it like you seem really angry could inflame you even further. So I do get that. A lot depends on the role that I'm playing in the conversation. So if you and I are in conflict, there's going to be a different approach that I'm going to take to it than if I'm helping you and a second person as the neutral third party. If I'm the neutral third party, I'm trying to get each of the parties to see each other more clearly, to understand each other's needs and wants and interests better. So I might take an approach of saying, let's say you're arguing with Billy. Billy, it feels to me like Ryan is pretty angry about what happened here with the two of you. Is that the way you see it, or how do you see it? Because I just want them to take a step back from the entrenched positions that they're holding to see each other as human beings who are entitled to their feelings. Again, borrowing from my younger son, he went through an exercise in second grade where they each would share how they're doing, and the response was always, "Thank you for sharing your feelings. Your feelings matter." And I obviously think that's useful for adults. And so it isn't necessarily verboten or totally off limits for someone helping others to be Dr. Obvious, so to speak, and to kind of point out something that they're seeing and just make sure before we progress too far down a path of trying to problem solve that we just sit with the uncomfortable emotions. I think that's okay. I think the flip side of that, if you and I were more directly in conflict, is maybe to avoid the label, but still sit with the state of heart or state of mind. So for example, you share with me how something that I did angered you. Rather than my saying you seem really angry or it seems like I angered you, it could be something more along the lines of, gosh, I know that I would be upset too if you had done something like that to me. Or I understand, I think, why it is that you feel what you feel after I acted this way. Or it must have been really hard carrying this around. This happened 2 weeks ago. It must have been really hard for you to have to carry this around all this time and us not have this chance to talk about it. I think that those provide for sort of a nuanced approach where it's less about me telling you what you feel or me trying to put you in some sort of category and more about me just being in the place that you're in, feeling what you're feeling. I think that's almost impossible, but at least understanding it at a pretty deep level and letting you know that. There is absolutely nothing more important to parties in conflict than to feel heard. Sometimes just hearing your words, not repeated verbatim, obviously, that can drive us nuts, but to be able to say, what I heard you say is that when I cut you off in that meeting, you really felt disrespected, and just leave it at that, not belabor it, just kind of let that be there and let the person feel some validation. Like, I'm not crazy. Like that really did happen, as opposed to, well, it looks like I really ticked you off. And one of the things that goes without saying, but probably needs to be said, is that so much of the way you're going to experience my reaction is rooted in things other than my words. I use different facial expressions just now. I use different inflection. And it's hard for me to give a formula to any of that because we all come from such different backgrounds and we all talk in very different ways. So I can easily say to you, well, don't make your voice spike like I just did with, I really ticked you off, but there could be reasons that would work well. So it's not easy to say, here's how to inflect, or here's how to use your facial expressions or your nonverbals. What I think is easier to convey to someone who's trying to get better at this is think about the reactions that you have to the way others inflect and use nonverbal communication. Think about what you would want to experience in that moment. I mean, it's in some ways just a version of the golden rule to do unto others, but it's meant to be sort of multilateral, not simply say the things to someone that you would want said to you, but show with your face, show with your inflection, show with your body posture what it is that you would want to hear if you were in that circumstance. So in some ways, maybe the empathy is almost from an action speaking louder than words perspective, meaning rather than my saying you sound really angry or you appear really upset, I'm using my body to kind of convey how seriously I'm taking what it is that you're saying. I'm not smirking, I'm not looking away, I'm not sort of closed like this.
Heard the famous quote, "We don't need to think alike to love alike." But I know it's much harder in the moment to actually practice that. Can you take us through some practical frameworks that you've used to help clients or students or people you're working with to actually solve conflicts or understand how to wrap their head around conflicts? For example, we've taught defining the problem, achieving understanding, identifying goals, both mutual and individual goals, brainstorming solutions, then selecting the best solution. And while that doesn't work word for word in the real world, it's a framework that might help us. And I know you have used more complex and more interesting frameworks than that one.
Well, there's a wisdom, of course, to a framework like that. And I think certainly when it comes to the basics of mediating conflict, that's where I start with the students. And I guess the only amendment or nuance I might give to what you shared just then is I really challenge the students to zoom in on this idea of positions versus interests, which if they've read Getting to Yes, they'll certainly be familiar with. But, it's this idea that, you and I may be bickering over, let's say, a work project, and I say, well, I deserve, to be first author and this and that, and you want to be first author or you want to speak at the meeting and I want to. And that's, a space where it feels tricky to come out with any sort of win, which isn't necessarily always need. I mean, obviously some cases are justifiably brought into a courtroom and need to be definitively resolved there or in other places. So I think we need to remind ourselves that when we say conflict resolution, sometimes that resolution is not to the full satisfaction of one of the parties, and that can be okay. But when we're dealing with collaborative kind of conflict resolution space, whether it be mediation, negotiation, facilitation, I think a lot of the frameworks just really pivot around the stories that each person is walking around with relative to what's going on, which are almost always, as in most books, preceded by a preface and, succeeded by some sort of epilogue. In other words, as we were talking about before, there's what we each experienced in the moment of when conflict broke out, which is usually very different, by the way, as we know. And then there's the stuff that led up to that experience and the stuff that I'm now taking out of that experience. And until we really sit down and hear each other's stories, it's really hard to understand the full pathway out of it. So there's actually a whole branch of mediation known as narrative mediation. And then there's another branch known as transformative mediation. And I don't claim to be experts in either, but one thing that really resonates with me in some of my work is I used to go to, say, a community town hall meeting that I was facilitating and lead with questions about what folks wanted the policy to be, or what do they want the park to look like, or, just be very sort of linear, like, we're here to get your input on X, please give us your input on X. And what I came to appreciate is that for 99% of the people going to those meetings, they didn't necessarily come in with that mindset. They came in with the mindset of something is being talked about that I think is going to affect or concern me in some way. And I want the folks convening this meeting to know that it affects or concerns me. And here's why. They may eventually get to a place where they can share more about how they think the issue should be addressed. And to be sure, one reflex that we have in American politics is to tell people what we're against and not as much what we're for. To your point earlier, we need to be able to define what it is that we're wanting to address, not just in a subject matter way, but in a specific problem statement. I think that is something that has to be arrived at. We need to be willing to spend a little bit of extra time in what some people might label as an icebreaker, but is much more of an informative and educational opportunity than I think we usually give it credit for. A lot of times icebreakers get used for silliness, to literally make the tension in the room feel reduced. And I counsel my students against that. I tell them, use the icebreaker in direct service to whatever the objective is for that conversation. So, for example, I've worked on racial profiling or racial inequities in policing, for example. I don't really want to open a meeting hearing what their favorite ice cream flavor is, but I would like to maybe explore an experience that they've had with law enforcement, or maybe the first time they were ever introduced to the idea of policing, even when they were a child. Because some of us may find that even if we are let's just say Black Lives Matter and a police union president, we both watched Hill Street Blues, we both watched NYPD Blue, or we both saw a cartoon when we were a child that involved that kind of a person. The framework there is almost conducting a joint interview where you're getting space to share in a sort of uninterrupted way, not for 15 minutes in a row, but I mean for more time than it might seem comfortable to allow someone to talk and not immediately respond, constructed in such a way. There's a model known as Conversation Cafe, where the notion is let's allow each person to speak, but first of all, let's have a talking piece, which may seem obvious or not a big deal, but when we think about the way we converse in casual conversation, we get cut off all the time. We lose the floor very easily. And for people who are shy, they may never get the floor back. They may never try to claim the floor. So let's use a talking piece as a signal that someone really gets to hold the floor and not have it swiped away from them. Let's also create the guideline or the directive that when Ryan speaks and then I speak, I'm not rebutting or even necessarily responding to Ryan, which I think comes very unnaturally to a lot of us in America. It's like I need to challenge it, I need to rebut it, I need to make sure everybody knows Ryan was incorrect or that, his answer was off base. I can think that. I may even indirectly come around to some message similar to that, but I think the framework of sort of the individual share as an integral part of the dialogue is almost mission critical to deepening the understanding and then producing some sort of potential agreement down the road. Sometimes it's a matter of sort of stepping back from the immediate need of solving a problem and recognizing that whatever the immediate problem is probably masking a much bigger issue that may or may not seem like it should be of my concern, but if I'm going to be in a relationship with you, it probably needs to be. In other words, if we're just going to collaborate one time, then maybe just addressing whatever that one problem is enough. I'm staying at a hotel. I had an issue with the customer service. I don't know that I need to know, they don't need to know my experience over time with customer service, and I don't need to know theirs. But if it's my parents and there's some issue with how I'm experiencing staying at their house and I intend to stay with them as long as they're alive, then it might be worth why does this keep happening? Let's talk about why is this still a problem for us? So I hope that answers the question. I think it's an interesting challenge to kind of name a framework in that way, but I think in general it's looking for the story beyond just the substance of what's being communicated.
This is the Storytelling Movement podcast, so I want to dive deeper now. I need to dive deeper into narrative mediation and how it differs from transformative mediation. Because I would argue transformative mediation has stories too, because stories are such an important part of how we can connect with others.
Well, sure. And to be clear, most of the mediation people experience in sort of the normal course of business is going to fall into what's called problem solving. What is the problem we're trying to address? What are the key issues that need to be resolved? And then what are some of the interests that each party has that need to be satisfied by whatever agreement we reach? Narrative basically takes it a step further, I think, and suggests that we can't just get down to business or brass tacks. We really need to learn more about the origins of this and the, experience of it and so on. And then transformative, I think, probably goes the deepest in saying, we need to understand story and we need to think about how we are going to redefine the relationship that we have. Meaning, even if we solve whatever problem we've set out to solve or whatever instigated our coming into mediation, we're not done. Because if we stop there, there's no reason to think that something else will emerge the next day or the next week. I think a lot of people lose patience or they don't want to stay in that uncomfortable spot of deep vulnerability, but I think there are textbooks written about it for a reason, and I think there are practitioners doing it for a reason. And a lot of the thorniest debates and conflicts that we have in America would probably benefit from this, particularly when we think about the relationship that many of our elected officials have towards one another, because it's clear that even if you get them to agree to disagree or compromise or settle something by majority vote, the vitriol often doesn't stop there. And some of this probably would be very applicable to those kinds of conflicts.
What advice do you have for people telling their story with the aim of helping with conflict mediation? The kinds of tips and tricks that we have for normal storytelling might not apply as well when we're talking about demonstrating respect.
It's a really interesting question because I guess part of where I went when I heard that question was thinking about the language that I'm using to explain the situation and filtering it through what I may have come to understand about your lens or your experience. So, for example, I'm thinking about how, despite being in a minority religion, I know that I present as a white male, heterosexual, cisgendered white male. And so there's enormous privilege that gets associated with me before I open my mouth. Maybe it's partly how I dress or look, but regardless, I know that. And so in my story, I may be taking greater pains to say I was lucky to have been, or I got to do such and such that a lot of people don't get. I narrowly avoided a certain consequence, without saying that it's because I'm a white man, but just, nodding to the fact that that's not everybody's experience. Or I think sometimes about differentiated treatment between women and men in workplaces, which of course persists sadly. And I might say, I did something that I think would have gotten a female colleague of mine in a lot of trouble, and I didn't face a consequence because of that. So it can be hard to know that. I mean, depending on the nature of the relationship I have with the other person, it can be very hard to know the way in which they will hear what it is that I'm saying. Certain colleagues of mine have really given me important guidance on, they've used different phrases like interrogating my intersectionality or just knowing myself in ways that I probably didn't used to think about myself. And in turn, recognizing that even if I'm with another cisgendered male white Jewish person, they're not going to have the same lived experiences. And so if I'm as a Texan talking to a New Yorker and the New Yorker doesn't understand why I didn't immediately confront somebody, just to borrow on a regional stereotype or something, it's like the New Yorker in me, because I do have New York relatives, the New Yorker in me would have just taken the guy by the shirt collar, but the Texan in me had to dance around it or something like that. Or the litigator's son that I am had to make a whole to-do about it, make a federal case about it, where I probably could have just compromised or talked it through. So that level of self-awareness, which often can be manifested as self-deprecation, often can create a certain amount of endearing quality, maybe a connection. Maybe the person can relate to something in what you're sharing. Obviously, trucking in hurtful stereotypes can be hugely damaging. So, I mean, I don't in any way suggest that I look at you and apply a stereotype to you that then I leverage. It's more, I had a conversation with my colleague the other day. We weren't in conflict, but he said something to me that added stress to the work that I'm doing. And I said, my Jewish American soul needs the extra stress. I can't work without a certain amount of anxiety. Something that sort of plays on the relatively benign stereotypes that every member of every group has, I think can sometimes break some ice or ease some of the tension. It's something that I think has to be very carefully considered. I think the bigger thing that I'm thinking about in relation to your question is just how we have to differentiate between venting and sharing. We can vent to close friends. We can vent to parents. We can vent to spouses. We can vent to professionals like a counselor or a clergy or an attorney, people that are underprivileged to keep what we're saying to themselves. That's not necessarily what we should do if we're trying to resolve a conflict. What we should do there is share the pertinent details that aren't as tinted by all of the emotion. We can narrate what the emotions were, almost as if we're reporting on ourselves, but we don't need to say like, that made me really angry. I've certainly done that in sharing a story with my wife or something, but not to resolve a conflict with my wife. That's less productive. So I do think we have to sort of think through, well, if I was reporting on this, if this was a story on the news, what would I emphasize? What are the most salient details? What are the things the other person needs to understand, as opposed to just let me let it all out in ways that can be repulsive.
What's the most important thing you want to leave our audience with? What's the thing that you never want them to forget next time they go into a conflict?
Well, I mean, I hate to boomerang back to the beginning of our conversation, but I guess I think sometimes about the evolution in my own emotional health, my own mental health, because I've certainly, like many people, had to work on things over the years in terms of being well in that way. And one of the things that I've had to work the most on is how I react to external emotional stimuli. So if you were to suddenly get angry with me now and start yelling, the me of 10, 15, 20 years ago would have really been scared, would have really felt heavy amounts of shame and guilt. And it's not to say that I no longer now care if you were to get angry with me, but it is to say that I'm able to separate that feeling from what I need to feel and not immediately assign myself significant blame that I then need to recover from just because you're emoting in a certain way. And so the one piece of advice I think I would impart is, if you find yourself in a conflict, know that you are just a human being. You are not a problematic person. You are not a difficult person. You're not more susceptible than anybody else. If you weren't in conflict, then you would be living an entirely isolated existence. And some people do, I suppose, but most of us live in some sort of community or family or otherwise. And so when you get into conflict, you're also usually you're in some closeness, you're in some connection, and that bond may be fraying or temporarily severed, but it often is recoverable, even for some of the most egregious acts committed by you or towards you. And I know this isn't a religious podcast, so I'm not going to get too deep into it, but I will say that my faith tradition really says a lot about this. We are counseled to repent the day before we die. And you hear that and you think, well, how am I supposed to know that? Well, that's obviously the point. So when we find ourselves in conflict, we should probably tell ourselves, well, get this resolved before you die, the day before you die. And obviously we never know when that's going to come, not to be too fatalistic. And so let's look for an opportunity as expediently as possible, when we have a clear enough head and heart to be able to listen and to be able to be curious and empathic and reach towards that other person, and know that doing that is the sign of real growth and real maturity, and getting into conflict is nothing more than an indication that you're alive.
A beautiful way to end. You made me think also of the quote by Viktor Frankl that is so useful in conflict, right? Between stimulus and response lies the choice, and in that choice lies the freedom. And I think that freedom, and how to take that freedom and use it productively, sums up a lot of how we manage conflict.
I appreciate you mentioning that. Obviously, for those who don't know, Frankl experienced arguably the worst acts of human cruelty in recorded history, in terms of the Holocaust. Of course, American slavery and plenty of other genocides are probably as egregious. I'm reminded, when you said that, of a moment after a mass shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, where the shooter was found to have had tremendous racial bigotry in his heart and targeted a black church and black victims. And he was brought forth for some sort of preliminary hearing, and a number of family and other close friends of the victims kept forgiving him. And I think it was just such a profoundly astonishing moment. And it may, for some people, have felt off-putting. It may have felt inauthentic or insincere, but I choose to take them at their word. I choose to believe that it is possible to, as you say, react to a stimulus in a way of my choosing. I'm not forced to react in a certain way. I'll just never forget that. And I'm not meaning to leave your listeners with this idea of immediately forgive everyone for everything, but I do think there's something really significant in running towards that kind of light wherever possible.
Beautiful. Dr. Schooler, where can people find you online if they wanted to connect?
It's a great question. I'd say LinkedIn is probably the best bet. I've got a website at UT if you Google my name, but happy to correspond and connect on LinkedIn or through the University of Texas at Austin.
Dr. Schooler, again, thank you for your time and for sharing your wisdom today.
It's a pleasure, Ryan. Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.